our conference with a very special keynote speech from Dr. Stella Nyanzi, who's here with us. And I couldn't be more excited and honored because her work frames so much our own work of many people here, and I'm sure is inspiring so many other people around the world. So Dr. Stella Nyanzi is a multiple award-winning medical anthropologist with specialization in sexual and reproductive health, sexual rights and human sexuality in Uganda and in the Gambia. She self-identifies as a radical queer feminist scholar, social justice activist, human rights defender, non-violent protester, poet, Facebooker, opposition political belonging to the Forum for Democratic Change in Uganda, former aspirant for Kampala Women Member of Parliament, and ex-prisoner from Luzira Women Maximum Security Prison, and not least, mother of 3 teenagers. She obtained a doctoral degree from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and she has experience of over 2 decades as an academic researcher with publication at the intersection of human rights, culture, health, sexualities, law, and human rights. Currently, she's a scholar of the Writer in Exile program of Penn Zentrum Deutschland. She has been living in exile in Germany with her children since January 2021, after living in Kenya as an asylum seeker for 3 months. She's not only an activist and a scholar of forced migration, but also has the lived experience of the same. And so it's a great enthusiasm that I welcome you, Stella. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Barbara Bompani, for the wonderful introduction. It's wonderful to be back in a university. We apologize for starting late. We're trying to get some music to play because, among other things, I do music. So what a joy and honor for me to participate in this African Queer and Trans Displacements Conference held here at University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. It is an honor to give the second keynote address because, hey, reviewer 2 has an interesting record among academics. I'm not being funny. Look at me as reviewer 2. But more seriously, for me, it is a joy to witness the birthing of a sub-discipline within queer African studies. A sub-discipline is being birthed, namely African queer and trans migration studies. And I want to say it again, a sub-discipline is being birthed. When Dr. B. Kaminga was starting the explorations between queer African and trans studies on the one hand, and migration studies on the other hand, the world should have stopped and taken notice, because indeed a subspeciality was being conceived. Thank you, B. Thank you very much for doing the hard and thankless work slowly and steadfastly over the years to create and co-create with others within the university in Africa and beyond, within the university, but outside the university as well. Thank you for co-creating this sub-discipline. Thank you for recognizing B. Kaminga. Thank you for insisting upon pushing the boundaries of the possibilities and refusing to see the borders of the impossibilities of academic knowledge production within universities in Africa. Very rarely do queer Africans in trans bodies undertake the courageous duty that B undertook. And so be in all your beingness, you're giving birth. Alas, we now have an entire conference focusing solely on multidisciplinary approaches to African queer and trans displacements. This is a huge achievement. I don't give praise. Anybody who knows me in the academy, ask my students, knows that I don't praise easily. But this is an achievement. I am envious. I celebrate you. I would have wanted to be in your shoes because this is how sub-disciplines are fashioned and created at the academy. So I would like to raise a couple of questions at the beginning after praising B, who I'm very sure I've embarrassed. The embarrassment for me is doing work. This is hard work, to recognize those who go before us, especially to recognize the difficulty of doing the work that has been done. So I'd like to raise a couple of questions right now to make us think like I like to be made to think. I would like a university that makes me think. What makes African displacements African? What? What is it that makes African displacements African? Is it the location, the place, the space in which displacements occur? Is it from where one is displaced? Is it where one goes? Is it about the continent, that African displacements happen on this continent called Africa? Does that include Morocco, where the Arabs and the Berbers sit? Are the Arabs and Berbers Africans? Does it include white South Africa? What about the little islands? Is African displacement about the continent, a geographical question, the land, the states, the national borders? Is this what we mean when we say African displacements? Isn't this focus on place, but just only one of the ingredients of African displacements? In fact, isn't it more than mere location that we're talking about? Of course it is, you're going to say to me. If an American white lesbian couple were displaced from Kampala to Nairobi, would this be African displacement? Yes? Silence. No? Yes, somebody thinks it would be. They are white, they are American, they are lesbian. They shift from Kampala because of homophobia, and they go to Nairobi. Does the place make this African displacement? Let's consider for a while the people. Is African displacements about the people or peoples involved? Is African displacement also about African peoples, whether voluntarily in motion or in forced motion, moving from one location to another? Is it about African identities, African inheritance, African descent, African heritage, African nationality or nationalities, or African multinationalities? Is it about African citizenship or residence? It's about the peoples of Africa undergoing displacement from one location to another, whether it is in the continent or not, whether it is in the global south or beyond, whether it is to and from the global south, whether it is in Africa or diaspora. Is African displacement about the people, the place? What is it about? What is this thing we're trying to conceptualize? What about the culture, the way of life, the values, the knowledge, meaning-making systems, beliefs, rituals, spirituality, traditions, food, ceremonies, dress, hairstyles, customs, ethos, those very things that my discipline, anthropology, and related subdisciplines such as cultural studies love to focus on? If an African person moved without their beliefs and values, is it still African displacement? If an African moved to a location in Africa where they're not allowed to worship their gods and goddesses or to venerate their ancestors, is that African displacement? Is it the idea of Africa, the dark heart of Africa, or Africa rising, or Africa against China, or even Wakanda forever? Whatever the dark heart, the resilient heart of Africa means, is it about the heart of Africa beating wherever it beats, and therefore the idea of Africa moving forcefully? Is that what we talk about? I suppose in asking this preliminary list of questions, what I would like to do is invite us to focus our thinking, our reading, our conceptual clarity, our theorizing on whether or not we indeed have a bounded category of study. Do we have a field of focus? Are we doing one thing or more? Is it a closed discipline, subdiscipline, sub-subdiscipline, or is it open for interrogation? In other words, when is African displacement African, and when is it not African? What are the ingredients of African displacement? Relatedly, what makes African displacement queer or trans, or both queer and trans? Is it the bodies involved in displacement? Is African queer and trans displacement thus derived from essentialist readings of the non-heteronormative sexual orientations and non-binary gender identities of people who are involved? Rhetoric question after rhetoric question, and I'm not yet done. Is it identitarian? Is it about sexual practices and desires and relationships? Is it about the grounds for displacement? Why were you displaced? Because of political, of oppression, of persecution on grounds of my sexual orientation or my gender identity. When is African displacement not queer or not trans? Can a queer person be displaced? A queer African person be displaced, but this does not qualify as queer Africa displacement. So when we say that we are developing the field of Africa queer and trans displacement studies, are we relying on international human rights law to define the categories, grounds for displacement, conditions of displacement, processes of resettlement, and so on for us? Is it about the passport that one carries or not? The passport one hands over to some regulator, or the new passport that one achieves? Is it the legalistic definitions that determine the scope and focus of our study? What about self-identifications, the ones that are not written down in the books of law and in the guidelines and policies given to case workers and lawyers, immigration lawyers? Who is included? Who is excluded? Who belongs as a legitimate concern? Is it just L for lesbian, GBTIQ, A plus, 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 plus? Are the pluses an invitation? Are the pluses taken away? Is the A not involved? Is the Q really there? And is Q just queer or questioning and quitting? Do X gays belong in this equation or not? Do XX gays who were gay and they converted from being gay and then they reconverted back and they reclaimed their gay identity, the XX gays, are they part of this too or not? Are cisgender people in? Seems like they're out, right? You're so cold. Are heterosexuals in the equation or out? What about children or siblings or parents of queer people? What about the case workers who work with queer and trans people? What about their service providers during displacement? What about the host communities? What is unique about what we are claiming to study? What, why, who, when, where? This is the time to ask the questions as a baby is being born. And so, as is evident from the past few minutes of my reflections, it is clear that I enter this space as a seeker, as a learner, a curious spirit, an inquisitive child. I've been called an adolescent, an inquiring explorer. Perhaps, unlike most of you here, I'm very tentative and largely unknowing. In fact, I am intelligent but raw and open to learning. What is African queer and trans displacement all about? What is not African queer and trans displacement? I still don't know. Bear with me as I make one small point, another small, annoying, but really intriguing point. Part of my joy of attending this conference comes from a sense of belonging. I am at home, I really am at home, and I want to thank John, Marnell, B. Kaminga, and Barbara Bompani have taken off their titles because titles don't matter when we're asking questions that matter. We will learn from those who know whether we have a title or not, whether they have a title or not. I am at home right under this label. It is true, I am not a lesbian. I am not a transgender person. If anything, I am cis-het, those people. You see, I am a displaced academic scholar. Displacement. To be displaced. A displaced African scholar of queer and trans Africa. Do I belong in this space? Although my displacement is not your displacement as defined so far. I was forcibly displaced from the university where I was producing academic knowledge. Thank you very much. Thank you for citing and referencing and criticizing some of my academic scholarly publications. Yesterday was very special. It was very affirming when some of you when some of you cited my academic publications. I was at home. These people know that I'm a queer African scholar. They may not agree with my ideas, but they know me. And that is good because in my universities in my country, my name is a name of ridicule. However, I have been outside formal employment of the academy since 2016, when I staged my insurgent nude protest at Makerere University, which led to my indefinite suspension. So the keynote here is being given in a queer fashion by a woman outside the academy. See, I was suspended indefinitely from Makerere University. Isn't this displacement? Isn't this African displacement? Now the anger has started. Those of you who know me know that I protest. Isn't this African queer trans displacement when a local producer of knowledge in Africa, an African queer studies scholar, is forcibly removed from the university? Isn't this queer and trans African displacement? What happened to my data about queer and trans people? Where are my hard drives? What happened to my bookshelves of box files nicely labeled, of interview transcripts with translations from Luganda into English and entered onto those hard drives? What happened to my backup copies? What happened to my hours upon hours upon hours of interviews recorded on mini cassettes? Isn't the displacement of my ethnographic research data about queer and trans people in a moment of queer homophobia, queerphobia and homophobia in Uganda, isn't this a component of queer African and trans displacement? I will not belabor the point any longer, but I look forward to some honest feedback from you to all my prodding, right from what African displacement, to what queer African displacement, to what African trans displacement, to whether or not I belong within this displacement. I look forward to some honest feedback from you. And so anyway, going on, after I was suspended from Makerere University for protesting in the nude, which I'm very proud of, I strengthened my activism, my politics, and my artistic creativity as a poet. I want to appreciate B. Kaminga again and the other conference organizers for generously buying 30 copies of my first 2 poetry books and sharing them with conference delegates. Thank you again that poetry has come into the academy and conference delegates have been given dissident poetry. Thank you for paying me 360 euro. I'm an exilee. No one pays for my poetry most of the time. Thank you mostly for sharing my books with conference delegates. This has allowed me to enter this academic space as a creative artist and a poet. To date, I have published 3 poetry collections. I brought them. I won't show them to you because you have them. The first, which is entitled No Roses from My Mouth. Maybe I will get it. And I'm sure you got copies of, right? And I'll hold it up for people who are on Zoom. That is why I got it, right? So this one is entitled No Roses from My Mouth, Poems from Prison. I wrote when I was serving an 18-month sentence in maximum security prison for writing a poem that criticized dictator Yoweri Museveni. I criticized him in a 6-stanza poem and went to Luzira Women for writing just one poem. But I came out of prison with a whole book collection of poems. Yes, that's laugh-worthy. I celebrate every time. That is what queer dissidence sometimes demands of us. But what has poetry got to do with us, with this conference, with you? You may be thinking, she is going off topic. What has poetry got to do with us? Poetry is a form of knowledge that travels fast and can move audiences. When I was locked up in prison, I never stopped producing African queer knowledge. In fact, if you have a copy of your book and you turn to page 152 and 153, there's a poem entitled Intersex in Prison. It is based on an intimate story of an inmate called Grace, who was my son, with whom we were locked up in a women's prison. Grace called me Mama Stella. Grace was locked up in an all-women's prison. Because of time, I will not read the poem right now, but suffice it to say that I'm very privileged to have immortalized Grace's intersexuality in this poem, because very sadly, he died in prison in 2020 during the early days of the COVID-19 lockdown. The poem has been read by prison authorities and discussed on TV in Uganda. That is how you move institutions. Poem on page 82, entitled Sappho Opportunities, Sappho referring to the lesbian island, is about women prisoners making love in prison. Very queer and very African and very dissident. And that's the sort of work I love to do. If I could write queer African poems in maximum security prison, you can also write wherever you are, right? Right? For a brief moment, let me turn to my fellow forced or voluntary migrants, refugees, asylum seekers. I'm called an exilee, who may be feeling heavily disillusioned by the seeming inertia of displacement, right? I know there's some refugees and asylum seekers in this space. You can use this period of inertia and nothingness and transitionariness to create your very own stories based on your unique experiences. Write your stories, be like Mercy, who was on a panel yesterday. Write your articles, participate in the work that is being produced about queers in exile. And thank you very much, 10 minutes. Write your book. If all else fails, write your poem or collection of poems. Okay? So if there are any people who are like me in exile, forced migrants, etc., please do the work. In fact, I'm not just daring you. My second book of poetry that was generously shared by the conference, entitled Don't Come in My Mouth. I don't mean that coming, I mean putting words in my mouth. It's politics, it's not sex all the time. Although we can use sex to talk to power. Poems That Rattled Uganda is a collection of poems that I wrote and compiled and sent to a publisher when I was an asylum seeker stuck in a safe protection house on the outskirts of Nairobi. So I wrote this book when I was struggling to find answers. I was with my children. And even as asylum seekers, we can generate and create knowledge. Oh, that was 20 minutes. Thank you, John. Even as asylum seekers, we can generate and create knowledge. We are not only data sources from which researchers and other experts extract knowledge. We have everything it takes to create or co-create our own bodies of knowledge based on our everyday experiences. Ask to participate in copyright and royalties. Another reason why poems matter, they are a powerful medium when crafted and targeted well. Poem 17 on pages 52 and 53 is the one for which I was imprisoned because my words disturbed the peace and quiet of the person of President Yoweri Museveni. Although I have published a lot of scholarly academic publications, none moved the entire state machinery in Uganda, the executive, the judiciary, parliament, everybody moved to come down upon Stella Nyanzi. None of all my academic scholarly publications have worked as powerfully as that short poem that I wrote to celebrate dictator Yoweri Museveni's birthday. And so sometimes all it takes is a scribbling, a poem, a short story. Very briefly, my third collection of poems entitled Eulogies of My Mouth, Poems of a Poisoned Uganda, is about the death of an enabler of the dictator. I wrote and published this collection of books this year after I fled to Germany. So I went to Germany in January of 2022, not 2021. That is okay, Barbara. And I went as a scholarship holder of the Writers in Exile program of Penn, Germany. When are exiles included in the narratives of displacement? Exiles are a special protected category of people, but we too are displaced. We may have status, we may have protection, we may have security. Our names may be known, but we too are displaced and have issues. So this further illustrates the point that displaced people can productively use the time to create knowledge. Stepping away from myself and refocusing the conversation onto Uganda LGBTIQA living in Kenya, I want to end by illustrating the powerful force of the arts, including music and poetry, in the lives of displaced queer and trans Ugandans. Did it work, John? If it didn't, it's okay. Okay. Okay, so in September of this year, I went back to Kenya for a poetry reading tour. I visited different communities across socio-economic classes in Nairobi, Nakuru. I will end with Bella's House. Bella's House is a safe shelter for Ugandan queer asylum seekers and refugees. If my internet was working now and working well, I would have shown you Bella's House. Unlike most other queer safe shelters, Bella's House is specifically providing safe shelter to trans migrants, and that is how they identify, most of whom come from Uganda, Rwanda, and the DRC. I took copies of my second poetry book to freely distribute to my residents, the residents at Bella's House that day. This book I felt would encourage some of them because they had been asking me about how I managed to navigate and successfully accomplish out-migration to Germany, yet I had come to Nairobi much later than they did. When I got there, I was overwhelmed by the welcome and reception. I was overwhelmed. My queer Ugandan sons and daughters, none of the three that I have back home in Germany, my nieces that are queer, my nephews that are queer, people who have willingly over the years called me Mama Stella. When some said we shall not call her Mama, they came with widespread arms and embraced me. They all took turns falling into my chest. They embraced me. My trans daughters got onto their knees in true Chiganda style and greeted me with their faces looking down. My trans mask men, they don't want to be called sons because they're like, I could be your lover. In fact, one told me he had to try his strap-on with me. My trans mask, yes. My trans mask men sat in chairs and spread their legs, and they greeted me like the men in Chiganda culture typically do. Is this queer? Is this normative? The girls kneeling gently, the men sitting with widespread legs. My daughters from Nature Network had been invited earlier by the men and boys at Bella's House to prepare traditional Chiganda food of matoke, rice, chicken, and groundnut paste. I was delighted. I was excited. I hadn't eaten matoke for a long time, maybe 6 months or more. We ate food and bubbly or fizzy drinks. I put my fingers in. We told stories of home and exile and refugee. We compared notes. We gossiped. I asked about love life. They told me about this and that. I asked about binders and they showed me. We laughed. I rebuked. I cancelled. We did what family gatherings do. I felt so much at home in this queer family. I loved Vela's house. Miriam Makeba performed. We danced. I decided not to read from my book, but instead listen to poems read and performed by any queer poets in the house. I made an invitation. I'm tired. I'm so happy. I will not do my own reading. Oh, are there any queer poets in the house? Surprise, surprise. Poet after poet after poet after poet came to perform. We were a bit tipsy, but the performances of poetry that had been written over the years, over the days, over the months were read and performed. And then from the corner, a silent poet asked me to read his poem for everyone around. He had been fiddling on his laptop while I was interacting with everybody. He was observing me silently, looking at me and fiddling on his laptop. And then he transferred a file onto his phone and he said to me, Mama Stella, read this for me. I would have loved my mother back home in Kabale to read this for me. So if the internet or the download had worked, I was going to play this son of mine, me reading his poem about binding and wanting top surgery. But what is so empowering about this is my last input. What is so empowering about Vela's house for me is the queer freedom that existed. Yes, there were some replicas of norms from Africa. Yes, there were gender roles, perhaps those we've criticized, that were being enacted, but there was queer love. There was queer displacement. There were queer Africans and trans people who are not ordinarily talked about. The young boys who knelt down and slaughtered the chickens. The unaccompanied young trans-mask people. I learned for the first time we no longer say trans men, we now say trans-mask. I was learning, they were learning. And so as I end, I want to revisit the question of what queer African queer and trans displacement means. It's a keynote. It's also question time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stella. Would you like to stay there so that they can see you? Thank you so much. Wow, so much to take on board. I got shivers. I don't know why. So we're going to take a question, round of 3 questions at a time, okay? And please use your mic so that they can hear us also online. Thank you so much. Question, comments, reaction, anything. Poems.
Just to say, we've got lots of emojis online as well. It's art and I think everywhere.
Is that good?
Yes.
Okay.
Everyone's loving you.
Thank you for the emojis online. Okay.
Yes. Oh, wow. Oh, my name is Mercy. Don't look at me like that. My name is Mercy. My pronouns are she, he. Mama, I just want to say, it's not a question, but I just want to say thank you so much. From yesterday when I saw John going deep into that documentary of Sula and Mama Makeba and them, coming from John, I'm sorry, not trying to place the race card on it. You feel like, okay, they want to know more about our experiences as migrants and refugees. But the way you spoke about it, you already brought me back home. And I felt like I wished I was there at the same place where you could have that freedom of expressing yourself to someone that is also understanding, or someone that has also had our struggles, their fair share of struggles. And I just want to thank you for that. I just want to thank you for that beautiful insight that you gave. You kept us also glued in, and wow, just speechless. Thank you so, so much, Mama.
Thank you very much. You're very kind. It's just a comment, but can I respond? I think that the whiteys, whoever they are, whether it's skin color, whether it's privilege, whether it's Europe, and is Australia part of Europe, John? Because you were referred to. Okay, but Australia also has colonized and colonizer. But one point I think that I want to say is that the whiteys, meaning privilege, so the Barbaras from Italy and UK, the Bs who are South African, the yes, all of you, the Neils, so I'm pointing them out. But maybe that's not the whiteness that we mean. I've seen another one. So I'm being I'm being very apartheid centered, okay? But coming away from skin color and focusing on privilege and what whiteness does, I think I hear you when you say, when John presents Makeba, it's extractive. But if John doesn't do the work, if B doesn't do the work, and I am not doing the work, who will do the work? Right? So I used to think that privilege must never be used to study us, but now I think we all have a stake in this. John's perspective is as important as Stella's perspective, as important as Masi's perspective, as important as Makeba's perspective. And when the poets in Vela's house say to me, "Oh, Mama, we can do poetry," I was like, "Let's see it, let's hear it, let's share it." And then as I was living, they say to me, "Instead of coming to read us your poems, come and teach us how to write better poetry." And so we are co-creating knowledge, right? So when John shares Makeba's dance, but John didn't make that video. Maybe John did. It is a co-creation of knowledge, yeah? And it's good for us to critique and criticize, but if we don't do the work, I think it still has to be done, yeah? And so come and do more of the work. And when we who are not, because I'm insider outsider, I'll never be lesbian. I'm still an outsider. I wish there was a Black transmasc PhD from Uganda studying transmasc refugees. I wish education happened like that. Anyway, that was one comment, and thank you for appreciating. Any other? Yes.
Okay, so I feel like I could turn it into a celebratory keynote of things that I absolutely loved about the things that you said, Stella. I feel so privileged to be in this space and to hear you to speak, to hear you, to learn from you. And before I ask my question, a few comments. One is I really appreciate your pushing us to think about privilege, you know, and as an African, I think of myself as an African in every single way. I think about the ways that my privilege can undercut too much of things that shouldn't be undercut to remain connected to some of the things that we're discussing. So I think it's really important to keep that question of privilege front of mind and to really think in deep ways about white supremacy and the ways in which even Black Africans can be deeply implicated in white supremacy and reproducing it as well. So anyway, much to discuss on that front, but just another thing that I want to say I'm really grateful for. I want to say also that I would give so much to have had you as a professor in university, you know, so as an academic, I'm even getting teary to think that you are not in those classes and that there are so many people who are deprived of having you as a professor is just so heartbreaking. And I'm showing my nerdy side because there's many other things I could have said, but that to me, I think is really hard. But my question is about the questions that you put to us, because in some ways, and I'm sure you have this sense as well, I think the range of questions that you ask speak to the urgency of this sub-discipline or sub-discipline, as you put it. But I wonder whether you think that there are some of those questions or some subset of questions that actually have to be answered at the beginning, because, you know, questions are very powerful. And I think questions and the space that is created here is actually about space for questions. But I do think some, and many questions, the value isn't in the answer, it's in the process of questioning. But some questions actually need to be answered, and some of them need to be answered now. And I'm curious about whether you think that there is a universe of questions that need answers sooner rather than later as this really important space opens up. So that's the question. And I want to say again that it's just such a deep privilege to be in your company. And if you want to give more keynotes, even after the conference is done, I will sign up to come and just sit in the audience. So thank you.
Thank you very much. You're very...
Yes, could you mind introducing yourself to the people online? who don't know
Yes,
you?
Tendai, she, they, any will work.
Right, and Tendai gave the first keynote. We must acknowledge you. So you set a very high standard, which I totally decided to depart from. And not be an academic, but be an inquirer, because what is academic knowledge production without inquiry? And so you're asking me about my questions. Thank you for the good things you said. I like good things being said about people. But the point about white supremacy, thank you for catching it. Because some of us look at our blacks. I learned about the coconut. Is it called the coconut? The what? Okay. Okay, so the different names for these things. So it's different people call it different things, but you're black on the outside and white on the inside is so it's one of the biggest illusions that some people look at color and think, and some of the whitest academics are so black skinned, and their experiences of underprivilege made them so white when they got to power, they forgot. But thank you for finding and catching that. Coming back to the academy, well, many professors are afraid I might undress again. I undressed rebelliously against powerful Mahmoud Mamdani. He has a history in South Africa. And sometimes when I've thought of going back to the university, I think, they'll ask me, do you want to undress if you don't agree? Maybe I will. Maybe I'll do something a little more radical. But I think that we set a bar with that protest. And if it means I never go back to a university appointment, my work is done. My work at the universities is done. I disrupted. PhDs don't undress in defiance. I did. I opened the door, and many others are doing it. But in terms of the questions, are there any that need answers? I'm asking today. I'm asking for us. If no one was asking before, I'll be so embarrassed, because I think we're at that tentative moment. And for me, I wouldn't close the possibilities. I would leave it open, but that is what I am. In fact, I'd have more questions about the questions. And if someone tried to give me answers now, I'd still think, And I suppose what I'm trying to do is to say to B, get more students, get more collaborators, get more resources to open up the field for us. Like Queer African Studies was opened up 20, maybe 30 years ago, and people thought it was so nouveau, so new. Open up the field. This is what we do. Hey, that is what you have done. B, push the boundaries. You're tired, but it's just starting. So gear up, go on holiday, and then do more of these things and get the books, because no one will do the work. No one is interested, right? And so to answer your question, Tendai, I will not give answers. If people want to, they can. I mean, the whole day to day, we're talking about borders and religion, and the whole program kind of, I'm asking around some of the things people are addressing, spirituality. If I go to Kenya, but I can't worship my ancestors, what is that? What sort of displacement is that? It's not just physical, it's something more. But I don't know the answers. I don't want to have the answers. I want to have the questions. That is what my research supervisor told me. Keep the questions going. When you know you have all the answers, close the discipline and open something else. Yeah. So I think each of those questions can answer a book. That's how books are written. Any other questions? I've taken over Barbara's role. Yes, there's a hand.
Rose, Shiha. So I think for me, I think it's your ability to be able to engage in political dissidence, especially within East Africa, you know. And for me, what I appreciate most, and not within the keynote speaking, but also just your work as well. Your ability to be able to speak out against governments and regimes that perpetuate colonial practices, and I think the power that you give to people outside their countries of birth, the power that you've given people to be able to speak out against their home countries, and against their home countries without fear of what will happen if they ever go back. For those of us who have the privilege to be able to go back, without fear of that, being able to use that power, being able to use spaces outside the country to be able to be like, look, do not praise this particular person, like it is from not a good place. I think for me, it's one of the best things to be able to know that I could do that, to be able to know that I can sit in a different country and speak power and speak against my country and speak against oppressive presidents without being afraid. So thanks for that. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's part of the work we do all the time. And I think if I don't do anything else, I can encourage someone to say, oh, she came and gave such a lousy keynote, but at least she gave it in South Africa and she talked about queer people and we're doing this work in, and that is part of the dissidence and defiance that we must insist to do this. And what I tend to say is, if I can do it, what about other people, right? Those of you who are home, those of you who are not home, those of you who are exiles, those who are not exile. If I'm in exile doing it, what about the people who are not in exile? If I'm not in the academy and I'm speaking at VITS, what about everybody else in the academy? What's stopping them from doing queer work, for example, right? And that is part of the work. Sometimes it's not an article. For me, it's no longer just an article or book chapter published by, which is the most Duke or Oxford, right? Oxford? Yeah. Or, okay. Sometimes the real work is just opening Pandora's box and saying, we shall do trans studies in diaspora. That is the keynote. The action, the defiant action, one Facebook tweet, one meeting, one small disruptive thing. And this is very disruptive. Any other questions? Any comments? Oh, now the hands are shooting up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many minutes do we have?
About 30 seconds.
Okay, 30 seconds. Everybody speak and then I won't respond. How is that?
No, if people want to have a conversation, we should go a little bit over. Yeah.
No.
We take this 5 and that's it.
There were, or people can go for tea.
No, we've got
And
conversation.
we can converse and go for tea at the same time. Let's do this now. Okay. Barbara, do your work. Do your work of managing the questions.
Let's do that. 5 questions and then we go next. We start from there? Yes.
And please introduce yourself for the people online.
Oh, yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Ndogozo Ingwana. I'm a researcher and PhD candidate here at the African Center for Migration and Society. It's good to have you guys visiting. I just want to start off by thanking Mom Stella for your very powerful presentation right now, or talk rather. And I'm curious to hear more about what you mentioned. You said something about we can use sex to talk to power. Later on in my presentation, hopefully people will still be awake. I will be kind of like speaking a bit on that, but I was curious to hear more of how do you envision us as scholar activists using sex to talk to power? Thank you.
Now that I've gotten over my embarrassment, thank you for your kind words and for everything you said. It's really, I don't know what it does, but it's nice to hear at the end of the
Your work.
About my work. I want to talk, I suppose I want to go background. First of all, I never imagined birthing a baby in this body, so that's been a new one for me. I want to think about this thing of as a sub-discipline or a discipline, because when I think of this baby, I think of being undisciplined. And I think of the 20 or 30 years that we have of queer African studies, whatever that thing has morphed into now, and where we see it sits in the world, and the questions many of us have about that. And my desire is that this baby shakes up the house, because I don't understand. This has been such a key part of what this discipline, the broader discipline, should be. And yeah, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the baby being undisciplined.
Okay. Let's do all. There were 5. Yeah, let's honor them.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm Amma. I'm coming. The gratitude had to come first. I'm Amma Josephine Budge Johnstone. I use she, they pronouns. I have a question about the kinds of spaces, the quality of spaces that I think one needs to create. I think it's been created here to ask these questions, these important questions that you're asking, not just as intellectual pursuits, right? Because we get these questions and we think, oh, how does this work in my work? You know, but actually I feel your questions as the personal's political questions. And so what kinds of spaces can we make? How do we make them so that people are brave enough, humble enough, interested enough to ask these questions of themselves and their practices and their communities, not just as intellectual pursuits, right? But as informing our work, because they inform who we are. Thank you.
Arnold.
I'm Arnold Mlaisho. I just want to say thank you so very much for everything that you've said, but I do have a question, because I remember the time I was all over. I think the fear for me was just going to jail and how I imagined jail to be, and also just seeing how everyone was talking about it, that no, once when I go there, I'll probably be the woman and they are all gonna gang up on me, and that couldn't just leave my mind. And my question is, how did you manage the time that you were taken to jail and still do the work without being oppressed? Because I read through your book, and mostly I could see you did quite a lot of work in jail. And how was it like without you being oppressed? And I would like to believe that, your book was published whilst you were still in jail. I would like to be corrected on that. Thank you.
Right. So I don't think I will answer everything. Just bang head and I'll stop. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I don't want to stop you. Just...
Bang head on the table, not bang head. Dirty John. So undisciplined, totally undisciplined. I'm sorry. Arnold, thank you for your question. Jail is a horrible place. Part of the conversations I've had with people in camps now in Kakuma is an equation that's made by, I think it's the necropolitics man who equates the camp to prison. Right? You can't leave. You need a permit. Prison at least takes you to court every once in a while, but when you're encamped, you are encamped. And so it's interesting for me that perhaps it is the fact that in South Africa you're not encamped. You are free, right, to settle in areas. You're smiling, but
not really. South Africa is an open prison to migrants.
Very good. Very good. That is my point, that for many queer people who fear prison, simply because you're not behind bars, you're already in a prison where one is. But the fear of rape, especially for non-binary bodied peoples, is a real fear. How did I not get oppressed? I was beaten and I lost my baby. I was 45 years old and I had a miscarriage. At 45, we don't hope to really conceive a lot. But I have missing teeth because they were knocked out, and the dentists in Germany can't do anything because the dentists in Luzira Women Prison did a botched job on me. I often was denied access to visitors. My notes were taken. These are some of my scribblings that we used to smuggle out. I had friends who helped. A lot of them were confiscated and burnt in my presence, right? But I had to write. I had to write. I had to write. And the book, yes, was the day I was released on acquittal. Instead of doing 18 months, I did 16 months. The day I was released, my friends came to court circulating and distributing this book. And for me, that is how to be undisciplined. They're trying to punish me for one poem. Hell no, I come out with many. Maybe it's not so good. I mean, poets have criticized what I write. That's okay, it's their business. But I did the book. I did the book in prison. In prison! If I did it in prison, how much more can be done? There was oppression, but for me, the need to write and keep writing and just the smuggling things out of prison was self-preservation. And I think that's why I'm writing in exile. I have to speak back. So the person who asked about how does one speak back? Yes, one has to speak back. If one is Stella Nyanzi, they have to speak back, because if we don't, then they win, right? Then they win. And I think the undressing at the university, the undressing in court at my sentencing is a speaking back. Even when they've taken off the cameras and the microphones at a teleconference sentencing, we undress and speak with our bodies, naked bodies. So the question about speaking through sex, same thing, metaphors. So the poem that took me to prison on page 17, I write about the vagina of the president's mother. I call it chuchu, I call it pussy, I call it cunt. I use all the words of the vagina in relation to misrule in Uganda. A lot of people focused on cunt, pussy, you know, pubic hair, clit. Talk about the president's mother's clitoris. She's dead, by the way, as being very disrespectful, intentionally so, because that is how one speaks truth to power with sex and genitalia. My first time of arrest for poetry, I called him a pair of buttocks, and that circulated the whole world, CNN, BBC, even Africa, even Asia and Japan. They were talking about the woman who called the president a pair of buttocks. That's how you use graphic little poems to speak truth to power and undo power. And it's really an invitation for me. If a pair of buttocks metaphor can upset the president, how much more beautiful poetry or an article or art, right? So it's not indecent, vulgar language just for the sake of being indecent, but it's to undo power and invite others to touch the hem of power. The question from B, Arnold is done. Ntokozo is done. B, totally. I mean, part of my problem with queer African studies now is, no, it's not funny. It's terrible. I mean, we've done progressive work. We've come, when I started, we were doing HIV AIDS work, you know, and then the MSM people came on board. And then, we've made a lot of leaps and bounds, but we've gone back to a particular mold. And now it's not so queer anymore. Right? If we're pushing boundaries, I think some of this work for me is really exciting because it's become so disciplinary and so disciplined. And there's now a whole thing about how to do queer studies. We can have a church choir and teach them how to read, how to do queer African studies. This is how we do it. It has to be multidisciplinary. You have to use human rights. Fuck. Oops, I'm not supposed to say fuck. but it is queer African studies. Part of my critique and part of my discomfort around just queer African studies, it's now become very disciplinary. I like the undisciplinary. That is why I claim queerness, because to constantly question the politics of knowledge generation, that is what queer theory and queer African studies gave me power to do, to question and say, that is what Marx said. Hey, what did Marx say? Okay, what did he not say? And that mischief, that rudeness, that dare, that audacity to question is what we need. I know it's time, John.
Discipline.
Now we can be indisciplined, but we have a whole day of activities. Is there anything I haven't said? I want to thank you very much for graciousness. This was not the typical keynote, but I enjoyed, and I'm sure we pushed the envelope, right? If I offended, I'm sorry. especially where pronouns go. You still have to teach us. Yeah, at the end of the day, I'm old school, and old school needs so much unlearning to do. So if there's offense, it wasn't intended. I will learn. If you call it out, if you don't call it out, sit with your misery. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. There is tea and coffee, and we come back in 10 minutes. Thanks.
No, we go straight into the next panel.
I'll go straight.
On that program, we don't have a break. As far as I. Sorry?
You're joking? John, you're joking, right?
No, maybe I'm wrong, but it was different today than it was.
At a schedule.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, you're saying there's no tea on the side?
Yeah, it was just not on the schedule. Yeah. Everyone plays. Through as please do. Yeah, of course. I was just responding to the comments on Zoom, and now we can